September 3, 1943. Camp Shelby, Mississippi. The tin can rattled across the wooden table as Sergeant Marco Bellini stared at what appeared to be a joke wrapped in olive drab packaging. For 6 weeks since his capture at Salerno, he had endured what American soldiers called C-rations, those rectangular boxes containing meals that seemed designed by people who had never tasted actual food. The ham and lima beans had earned particular mockery among the Italian prisoners, a gelatinous mixture that bore no resemblance to anything edible in Mediterranean cuisine. Yet now, watching through the wire fence as United States Marines unloaded their field supplies from transport trucks, Bellini witnessed something that would shatter every assumption he held about American military incompetence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The first indication that something fundamental had shifted came not from the packaging, but from the Marines themselves. These men moved with precision that contrasted sharply with the casual attitude of Army personnel who had processed Italian prisoners through the previous months. Their uniforms showed creases that suggested discipline rather than merely regulation compliance. Most tellingly, they handled their ration containers with something approaching reverence rather than the resigned disgust that Army soldiers displayed toward their C-ration boxes. Bellini had learned enough English during his captivity to understand the conversations drifting across the compound. The Marines were discussing their meals with enthusiasm that seemed inappropriate for military provisions. They spoke of components by name rather than merely complaining about field rations in general. One lance corporal mentioned something called a tropical chocolate bar with the same tone Italian soldiers reserved for discussing their mother's cooking. Another Marine described crackers that actually tasted like food rather than compressed cardboard. The Italian prisoners had spent weeks developing elaborate mockery of American military food. They had created songs about the ham and lima beans, comedic routines about the tasteless biscuits, and extended philosophical discussions about how a nation with such agricultural abundance could produce rations so profoundly unappetizing. The C-ration had become proof of American cultural bankruptcy, evidence that democratic societies produced citizens too soft to appreciate proper military discipline or understand the warrior's relationship with sustenance. Bellini himself had served in North Africa with the RE Division, experiencing Italian military rations that ranged from adequate to barely edible depending on supply line functionality. The canned beef had been tolerable when fresh. The pasta occasionally approached acceptable quality. The wine, even the terrible vintage allocated to enlisted men, carried flavors that connected soldiers to home and tradition. American C-rations seemed designed by committees who had never considered that food might serve purposes beyond caloric intake. The mockery had bonded Italian prisoners across regional differences that normally divided them. Sicilians and Lombards who would have argued endlessly about cooking methods found common ground in ridiculing American ham and lima beans. Romans and Neapolitans who disputed every aspect of pasta preparation united in their contempt for crackers that crumbled into dust. The shared experience of enduring American Army rations had created solidarity that combat operations had never achieved. Yet watching these Marines unpack their supplies triggered uncertainty that Bellini tried to suppress. The quantities seemed excessive for field rations meant to sustain soldiers during combat operations. Each Marine carried what appeared to be multiple meal containers rather than the single daily ration that Italian soldiers had received even during successful campaigns. The packaging itself showed quality that suggested investment rather than merely functional supply allocation. Camp Shelby had been established to train American infantry divisions before deployment overseas, but it also housed several thousand Italian prisoners captured during the Sicily campaign and subsequent mainland operations. The facility sprawled across Mississippi pine forests, connected by roads that demonstrated engineering capacity that exceeded anything Bellini had witnessed in Italian military construction. Electric power reached every structure. Running water flowed constantly. The infrastructure suggested resources allocated to prisoner housing that Italian forces had never provided for their own frontline troops. The separation between Army and Marine facilities within the larger camp complex had seemed arbitrary until this moment. Army personnel treated their assignment as temporary duty before deployment to combat theaters. They processed prisoners with efficient indifference, maintained security with casual competence, and generally displayed the attitude of men performing necessary but unexciting tasks. The Marines arriving today carried themselves differently, suggesting standards that exceeded basic military adequacy. Bellini had been designated interpreter for his compound due to the English he had learned from a British tutor during his youth in Milan. His father, a textile merchant who traded internationally, had insisted on language education that seemed unnecessary for someone destined to inherit a family business. The war had transformed that education into survival skill, making Bellini valuable to both Italian prisoners who needed translation and American authorities who required communication capability. The role provided access to information that ordinary prisoners never received. He attended meetings where American officers discussed camp operations, translated during medical examinations, and facilitated the countless administrative processes that accompanied prisoner management. The position had revealed American organizational methods that challenged Italian assumptions about democratic chaos producing military inefficiency. Everything was documented, systematized, and processed through procedures that functioned despite appearing unnecessarily complicated. But nothing he had witnessed prepared him for what happened when the Marines began their midday meal. The ritual unfolded with choreographed precision that suggested tradition rather than merely following regulations. Each Marine opened his ration container with movements that showed familiarity bordering on affection. They arranged components in specific patterns, shared items according to unspoken protocols, and consumed their meals with focus that contrasted sharply with Army soldiers who ate while complaining. The first shock came from the packaging itself. Where C-ration containers showed utilitarian design prioritizing durability and ease of manufacture, Marine rations came in boxes that displayed attention to detail suggesting someone had actually considered the user experience. The printing was clearer, the opening mechanisms more intuitive, and the internal organization more logical. Small touches like waxed paper separators and moisture-resistant coatings indicated design iteration that had refined the product through multiple generations. Then came the components. A Marine corporal near the fence line opened his container to reveal items that bore no resemblance to C-ration contents. The crackers emerged intact rather than pulverized, suggesting packaging that actually protected contents during transport. A tin of cheese showed manufacturing quality that indicated actual dairy products rather than mysterious substances vaguely cheese-adjacent. Most remarkably, a chocolate bar emerged in perfect condition despite Mississippi heat that should have reduced it to melted catastrophe. Bellini watched the corporal consume his meal with methodical appreciation that transcended mere hunger satisfaction. Each component received attention suggesting value beyond caloric content. The crackers were examined for damage before consumption. The cheese was spread with care that implied respect for ingredients. The chocolate was divided into precise portions that would be distributed among fellow Marines according to some system that Bellini couldn't quite discern. Other Marines nearby displayed similar behaviors, creating collective dining experience that resembled traditional military mess hall protocols compressed into field conditions. They shared components, traded items based on personal preferences, and maintained conversation that focused on meal quality with seriousness that seemed disproportionate to the situation. These men were discussing military rations with the same intensity that Italian soldiers reserved for debating regional cooking superiority. The Italian prisoners watching from their compound fell silent. The mockery that had sustained them through weeks of C-ration endurance evaporated as they witnessed Marines treating field rations as actual food rather than necessary evil. Something fundamental had shifted in their understanding of American military culture. These Marines weren't merely enduring their provisions. They were appreciating them. Lieutenant Antonio Russo, who had commanded a tank platoon before his capture, moved beside Bellini at the fence. His English was minimal, requiring Bellini to translate the Marine conversations he could overhear. Russo listened with intensity that suggested he was processing implications beyond mere food quality. As an officer who had managed logistics for armored operations, he understood that ration quality reflected supply chain sophistication and resource allocation priorities that revealed deeper truths about military organizations. the Marines finished their meal with ritual that included careful disposal of packaging, cleaning of utensils, and redistribution of remaining components according to protocols that appeared automatic rather than imposed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. No officers supervised this process. No regulations were referenced. The behavior emerged from training so thorough that it had become instinctive, suggesting organizational culture that valued discipline maintained through internalized standards rather than external enforcement. As the Marines prepared to depart for afternoon training exercises, one lance corporal approached the fence carrying an unopened ration container. His name tape read Henderson, and his expression suggested amusement rather than hostility. He spoke to the nearest Italian prisoner in heavily accented but comprehensible Italian that indicated language training as part of his military preparation. The Marine explained that he had been issued extra rations for the day's extended field exercise and wondered if the Italian prisoners might be interested in examining American Marine provisions. The offer came without condescension or mockery, delivered with straightforward courtesy that suggested genuine interest in cultural exchange rather than psychological warfare. Henderson handed the container through the fence to Bellini, nodded respectfully, and departed to join his unit. The ration box sat on the compound table like archaeological artifact from advanced civilization. 30 Italian prisoners crowded around examining packaging that seemed designed by people who actually cared about soldiers who would consume the contents. The printing showed production dates suggesting recent manufacture. The components were listed in multiple languages including Italian, indicating someone had considered that these rations might be encountered by non-English speakers. Small details like waterproof matches and included can opener demonstrated attention to field utility that exceeded anything they had experienced. Bellini opened the container using the provided tool, which functioned smoothly rather than requiring the violent prying that C-ration cans demanded. Inside, components were arranged with logic that suggested organizational thinking rather than random packaging. Each item occupied specific position that protected it from damage while maximizing space efficiency. The crackers came in sealed packages that had prevented crushing. The cheese tin showed manufacturing quality that indicated actual quality control rather than merely meeting minimum specifications. The first item Bellini extracted was labeled ham and eggs, chopped, which triggered immediate skepticism given their experience with ham and lima beans. But opening the tin revealed contents that actually resembled the description. The texture showed proper emulsification rather than separated gelatinous horror. The aroma, while not appetizing by Italian standards, at least suggested actual meat products rather than mysterious protein sources. Most remarkably, heating instructions were included, suggesting these rations were designed for consumption in something approaching civilized conditions rather than merely desperate field feeding. Lieutenant Russo examined the crackers with professional interest that transcended personal hunger. He had managed supply logistics and understood that field ration quality reflected manufacturing sophistication and distribution capacity that revealed organizational capability. These crackers showed production methods that maintained integrity during transport and storage. The packaging protected contents from moisture and crushing. Small details like scored edges for easy breaking indicated design iteration that had refined product through multiple generations of testing and feedback. The chocolate bar provoked particular amazement. American tropical chocolate had legendary status among Italian soldiers who had captured American supplies during North African operations. The special formula remained solid in desert heat that melted Italian chocolate into useless liquid. German forces had tried to reverse engineer the product without success, suggesting American food chemistry had achieved sophistication that European manufacturers couldn't replicate. Holding an intact bar in Mississippi, humidity that should have destroyed normal chocolate demonstrated technological advancement disguised as simple field ration component. Corporal Giuseppe Ferrara, a former baker from Naples, examined the crackers with professional scrutiny that his pre-war occupation enabled. He broke one carefully, studying the interior texture and crumb structure with expertise that transcended military context. His verdict, delivered in Neapolitan dialect that Bellini translated for those who couldn't understand, was devastating to Italian military pride. These crackers showed production methods that maintained quality at scale. The ingredients included actual butter rather than substitutes. The baking process had achieved proper texture that remained stable during storage. The group consumed the ration components with silence that reflected processing of implications beyond immediate hunger satisfaction. Each item challenged assumptions about American military culture and industrial capacity. The cheese spread easily rather than requiring excavation from its container. The fruit bar contained recognizable fruit rather than mysterious sweet substance vaguely fruit-adjacent. Even the accessory packet showed thoughtfulness, including toilet paper, matches, cigarettes, and chewing gum arranged in weather-resistant packaging. As evening approached and guards distributed the regular C-ration dinner to Italian prisoners, the contrast became unbearable. The ham and lima beans that had provided comedy material for weeks now seemed cruel reminder of their status as army prisoners rather than Marine captives. Every Italian in the compound understood that American military forces maintained different standards for different service branches, but the magnitude of disparity suggested organizational priorities that contradicted everything they believed about democratic chaos producing uniform mediocrity. Bellini lay on his bunk that night processing implications that extended beyond meal quality. The Marines they had observed weren't elite soldiers receiving special provisions as reward for extraordinary service. They were regular combat infantry receiving standard-issue field rations that happened to exceed Italian military provisions in quality, variety, and thoughtful design. If ordinary American Marines ate better than Italian officers during successful campaigns, what did that reveal about relative industrial capacity and resource allocation priorities? The mathematics became increasingly disturbing upon reflection. Those Marine rations represented supply chain sophistication that began with agricultural production, continued through manufacturing processes, and culminated in distribution networks that delivered quality products to combat zones across multiple theaters of operation. Each component reflected decisions about resource allocation, production priorities, and logistical coordination that revealed organizational capability operating at scales that Italian military systems had never attempted. The tropical chocolate alone demonstrated technological advancement that transcended simple food chemistry. Creating chocolate that remained solid at high temperatures required understanding of fat crystal structures, careful ingredient selection, and manufacturing processes that controlled variables with precision that Italian facilities couldn't achieve. The casual inclusion of such sophisticated products in standard field rations suggested R&D investment and production capacity allocated to soldier comfort that Italian forces had never considered viable during wartime operations. Sleep came slowly that night as Bellini contemplated transformation of understanding that single Marine ration container had triggered. The mockery that had sustained Italian prisoners through weeks of C-ration endurance now seemed childish deflection from uncomfortable truths. They had been laughing at American Army provisions while remaining ignorant of Marine standards that exceeded anything they had experienced. The discovery suggested American military culture maintained excellence through competitive standards between service branches rather than uniform adequacy across all forces. Morning brought unexpected development that would accelerate the education Italian prisoners were receiving about American military culture. Camp administrators announced that Marine Corps representatives would be conducting inspection of prisoner facilities as part of evaluation for potential labor assignments to Marine Corps projects in the region. The inspection would include interviews with prisoners who possessed skills potentially valuable for construction, maintenance, and support operations that Marines were undertaking at nearby training facilities. The opportunity represented potential escape from C-ration monotony, but more significantly, it offered chance to witness Marine Corps operations firsthand rather than merely observing from distant fence lines. Bellini volunteered immediately along with dozens of other prisoners eager for any variation in camp routine. Lieutenant Russo pulled him aside with warning delivered in undertones that suggested officers' concern about maintaining morale among increasingly demoralized men. The Marine Corps, Russo explained, maintained reputation throughout Italian military for fanaticism that bordered on insanity. They charged fortified positions that sane soldiers would have bypassed. They accepted casualty rates that other services considered unsustainable. Their training produced men who seemed to welcome combat conditions that normal humans fled. Getting closer to such warriors might reveal truths more disturbing than Marine ration superiority. But Bellini's curiosity had been awakened by that single meal observation. He needed to understand how military organization could produce soldiers who treated field rations with respect, maintained discipline without visible enforcement, and apparently volunteered for service that exceeded normal military obligations. The Marines represented something fundamentally different from both Italian military culture and the American Army forces he had encountered. Understanding that difference might provide insight into why Italy was losing a war that had seemed winnable just months earlier. The inspection team arrived in vehicles that showed maintenance standards exceeding normal military adequacy. The trucks were clean beyond operational necessity, showing care that suggested pride of ownership rather than merely following regulations. Marines emerged with uniforms that displayed creases indicating attention to appearance that transcended basic military bearing. Their equipment was arranged with systematic precision that revealed training emphasizing preparation and readiness as fundamental values rather than merely tactical requirements. Captain James Morrison commanded the inspection team with authority that derived from competence rather than rank insignia. He addressed the assembled Italian prisoners in Italian that showed language training significantly beyond basic military necessity, suggesting Marine Corps invested in cultural preparation that exceeded anything Italian forces provided their own troops before deployment. His message was straightforward without condescension, explaining that Marines were seeking skilled workers for construction projects and that selected prisoners would receive appropriate compensation including improved rations for duration of their service. The mention of improved rations triggered immediate interest among prisoners who had endured weeks of C-ration monotony. Morrison noted the response with a slight smile that suggested he understood exactly what motivated their enthusiasm. He explained that Marines maintained their own supply chains independent of Army logistics, procuring provisions specifically designed for Marine Corps standards. Prisoners selected for work assignments would receive the same rations as Marine personnel rather than standard Army prisoner allocations. The interviews were conducted with efficiency that demonstrated organizational capability operating at high competence levels. Each prisoner was assessed for skills, physical capability, and English language proficiency through structured questions that revealed information useful for work assignment without unnecessary complexity. Bellini's interpretation skills made him obvious candidate for selection, but Morrison spent additional time probing his background in ways that suggested interest beyond merely securing translator services. Questions focused on Bellini's pre-war education, his family's business operations, and his observations about supply chain management during his military service. Morrison seemed particularly interested in Bellini's perspectives on comparative logistics between Italian and American systems, pursuing details about procurement methods, distribution networks, and quality control processes with intensity that suggested strategic intelligence gathering rather than merely administrative processing. The selection results posted that evening included 30 Italian prisoners designated for Marine Corps work assignments beginning the following week. Bellini's name appeared at the top of the list, designated as primary translator and liaison between Marine supervisors and Italian work crews. The appointment carried implications beyond merely escaping C-rations. He would be embedded within Marine Corps operations, witnessing their culture and methods from an insider perspective that few enemy prisoners ever achieved. The week preceding their transfer to Marine facilities brought accelerated education and comparative military culture through seemingly casual interactions. Army guards who had processed prisoners with efficient indifference suddenly displayed opinions about Marines that revealed inter-service rivalry producing competitive excellence rather than unified mediocrity. The soldiers acknowledged that Marines ate better, trained harder, maintained higher standards, and generally exceeded Army performance across multiple metrics while simultaneously insisting that such fanaticism was unnecessary for effective military operations. The rivalry itself provided insight into American military organization that Italian forces lacked. Rather than centralizing standards and eliminating variation, American armed services apparently encouraged competition between branches that drove continuous improvement. Marines maintained superior rations not through superior resource allocation but through organizational culture that demanded excellence and refused to accept adequate when superior was achievable. The Army could theoretically procure similar provisions but chose different priorities that emphasized other operational capabilities. The economic implications were staggering upon reflection. American military organization could support multiple service branches maintaining different standards, competing for resources, and developing distinct operational cultures without collapsing into chaos or resource exhaustion. The industrial capacity required to provide superior rations to Marines while simultaneously supplying adequate provisions to Army forces exceeded anything Italian military planning had considered possible during wartime operations. September 10, 1943 brought the transfer to Marine Corps facilities adjacent to Camp Shelby's main compound. The morning began with issue of work clothing that demonstrated attention to detail exceeding normal prisoner processing. The garments were clean, properly sized, and showed manufacturing quality that suggested they were regular Marine working uniforms rather than special prisoner allocations. Each man received boots that actually fit rather than merely approximating correct sizes, indicating supply systems that maintained inventory depth enabling proper equipment matching. The transport trucks delivered them to a construction site where Marines were building additional training facilities for amphibious operations. The scale of the project exceeded anything Bellini had witnessed during his military service. Bulldozers moved earth with efficiency that suggested mechanical capability far beyond Italian engineering standards. Concrete mixers operated continuously, supplied by trucks that arrived with mathematical precision suggesting logistics coordination that functioned automatically rather than requiring constant supervision. But the revelation that would fundamentally transform his understanding arrived at precisely 1100 hours when a field kitchen truck appeared and Marines began preparing the midday meal. Bellini had assumed that improved rations meant better quality C-rations, perhaps newer production runs or enhanced component selection. What he witnessed instead challenged every assumption about field feeding he had developed during years of military service. The Marines were cooking actual food. Not opening cans and heating contents, but preparing meals using fresh ingredients delivered that morning from regional suppliers. A staff sergeant named Williams supervised the operation with the same intensity that Italian officers reserved for combat preparations. Vegetables were cleaned and chopped with precision. Meat was seasoned and grilled over controlled flames. Bread arrived fresh from a bakery that apparently supplied Marine facilities throughout the region. The Italian work crew stood paralyzed watching this impossible scene unfold. Giuseppe Ferrara, the former baker, approached the field kitchen with expression suggesting he was witnessing religious miracle. He spoke to Williams in broken English, asking permission to observe the bread that was being sliced for sandwiches. The sergeant handed him a loaf with casual generosity that suggested sharing food with enemy prisoners seemed natural rather than requiring authorization. Ferrara examined the bread with professional expertise that his pre-war occupation enabled. He pressed the crust, studied the crumb structure, inhaled the aroma with concentration that transcended hunger. His assessment, delivered in rapid Neapolitan that Bellini struggled to translate, confirmed what seemed impossible. This was real bread, properly made with quality flour, correct fermentation, and baking techniques that produced genuine product rather than merely edible substitute. The meal service operated with efficiency that demonstrated organizational systems functioning at high competence levels. Each Marine received portions calculated to provide proper nutrition without waste. The sandwiches were assembled with care suggesting someone actually considered that food quality affected morale and performance. Fresh fruit accompanied each meal, oranges and apples that had been unavailable to Italian civilians for years. Most remarkably, the Marines consumed their meals with appreciation that suggested this level of field feeding was routine rather than special occasion. Captain Morrison approached Bellini during the meal service carrying 2 trays loaded with food identical to what Marines were consuming. He handed one to Bellini and gestured toward a shaded area where they could eat while discussing the afternoon's work assignments. The casual equality of this gesture carried implications that Bellini needed time to process. An American officer was sharing his meal with an enemy prisoner without apparent concern about status differences or security protocols. The sandwich contained actual ham, not the mysterious canned substance that Army rations provided, but recognizable meat that had been recently cooked and properly seasoned. The bread was fresh enough to compress slightly under gentle pressure, indicating it had been baked within hours rather than weeks earlier. Vegetables added texture and flavor that transformed the simple sandwich into a meal that exceeded what Italian officers received during successful campaigns. Morrison ate methodically while explaining Marine Corps philosophy about field rations and soldier welfare. The Marines had concluded decades earlier that combat effectiveness required proper nutrition delivered through food that soldiers would actually want to consume. They had invested in supply chains that could deliver fresh provisions to forward areas, developed field kitchens that could prepare proper meals under combat conditions, and trained cooks who understood that feeding Marines properly was as important as maintaining their weapons. The economic implications of this philosophy were staggering when Bellini considered them carefully. Delivering fresh bread to construction sites in Mississippi required coordination between bakeries, transportation networks, and supply officers that functioned daily without apparent difficulty. Extending such systems to actual combat zones across multiple theaters of operation suggested logistics capability that exceeded anything Italian military planning had considered achievable during wartime. Morrison continued explaining that Marine rations came in multiple configurations depending on operational circumstances. When fresh food delivery was impossible, they used field rations that significantly exceeded C-ration quality. When circumstances permitted, they established field kitchens that prepared actual meals. When extended operations required maximum mobility, they carried emergency rations that provided complete nutrition in compact packages designed for consumption during combat. The variety itself demonstrated organizational sophistication that Italian forces had never attempted. Rather than standardizing on single ration type and accepting whatever deficiencies that created, Marines had developed multiple solutions optimized for different operational requirements. The investment in logistics and supply chain management suggested resource allocation priorities that valued soldier welfare as force multiplier rather than unnecessary luxury. Afternoon work assignments brought Bellini into direct contact with Marine Corps training culture that explained how organization could maintain such high standards. The construction project was supervised by Marine engineers who approached their work with intensity that seemed excessive for building training facilities. Every measurement was verified, each material was inspected, and all work was evaluated against standards that demanded excellence rather than merely accepting adequacy. A young corporal named Patterson explained the Marine approach to Bellini during a water break. The Corps maintained standards because individual Marines internalized expectations rather than merely following orders. Training emphasized that half measures were unacceptable, that excellence was minimum standard, and that every Marine was personally responsible for upholding organizational reputation. The culture produced soldiers who demanded quality from themselves rather than requiring constant supervision to prevent corner cutting. The connection between field rations and organizational culture became clear through Patterson's explanation. Marines ate well because they refused to accept inferior provisions. They maintained supply chains that delivered quality food because Marines expected quality in everything. The rations weren't reward for exceptional service but reflection of standards that pervaded every aspect of Marine Corps operations. Evening brought another revelation that completed Bellini's education in comparative military culture. The dinner service featured hot meals prepared in field kitchens that had been erected adjacent to the construction site. The menu included roasted chicken, fresh vegetables, potatoes prepared with actual butter, and desserts that exceeded anything Italian prisoners had imagined possible in field conditions. The portions were generous without being wasteful, calculated to provide proper nutrition for men performing heavy physical labor. Bellini sat with Lieutenant Russo discussing implications that extended far beyond immediate hunger satisfaction. These Marines weren't elite troops receiving special treatment. They were ordinary combat infantry receiving standard provisions that happened to exceed Italian officer rations during successful operations. If American military culture could maintain such standards for regular forces across multiple service branches, what did that reveal about industrial capacity and economic systems that made such abundance routine rather than extraordinary? Russo had managed logistics for armored operations and understood supply chain complexity. His analysis was delivered quietly to avoid other prisoners overhearing assessments that might damage morale. The Marine Corps alone probably consumed more quality food daily than entire Italian military forces received during active campaigns. Extending such provisioning across Army, Navy, and Air Force suggested agricultural production and distribution capability that rendered scarcity impossible rather than merely challenging. The weeks that followed brought systematic education in American military culture through daily exposure to Marine Corps standards. The Italian work crews witnessed training exercises that demonstrated intensity exceeding anything they had experienced during their own military service. Marines conducted forced marches carrying full equipment in Mississippi heat that would have hospitalized Italian soldiers. They performed obstacle courses that seemed designed to injure rather than train. They maintained discipline without visible enforcement, suggesting internalized standards that made external control unnecessary. But parallel to the demanding training ran supply systems that ensured Marines remained properly fed regardless of operational tempo. Field kitchens appeared during extended exercises, delivering hot meals to Marines who had been training for 12 hours straight. Fresh water was available constantly through distribution networks that functioned automatically. Even during simulated combat operations that stressed every system, food service maintained quality that exceeded Italian garrison standards. Bellini documented these observations in letters that would eventually reach family members surviving in occupied Italy. His descriptions of Marine Corps rations seemed so fantastic that recipients initially suspected propaganda fabrication. How could enemy prisoners consume better food daily than Italian civilians received monthly? The mathematics seemed impossible until corroborated by multiple independent sources confirming that American military provisioning exceeded European civilian standards even during total war. The transformation was completed not through single revelation but through accumulated evidence that demolished every assumption about American weakness and democratic inefficiency. These Marines eating fresh bread and roasted chicken weren't soft citizens playing at soldier. They were warriors maintaining standards that produced combat effectiveness through attention to fundamentals that included proper nutrition. The food was a reward for service but investment in capability that recognized well-fed soldiers fought better than hungry ones. December brought news of Italian surrender and the complicated emotions that accompanied transformation from enemy combatants to co-belligerents technically allied with forces that had defeated them. For Bellini and his companions, the shift meant continued work assignments with Marines who now treated them as partners rather than prisoners. The rations remained identical, demonstrating that Marine standards applied regardless of political circumstances or military necessities. The final education came during Christmas celebrations that revealed American military culture at its most characteristic. Marine Corps tradition included elaborate holiday meals that exceeded anything Bellini had experienced even during peacetime prosperity. Turkey prepared with expertise that professional chefs would respect, vegetables seasoned properly rather than merely cooked, desserts that demonstrated baking sophistication beyond simple field kitchen capability. Most remarkably, Italian workers received identical meals to Marines, sitting together at tables where recent enemies shared food that transcended military necessity. Captain Morrison delivered remarks during the celebration that Bellini would remember for decades. The Marine Corps, Morrison explained, maintained high standards because excellence was habit rather than occasional achievement. They fed their Marines well because proper nutrition enabled proper performance. They extended the same provisions to Italian workers because standards applied universally rather than selectively. The culture demanded quality in everything, from combat operations to daily meals, because Marines refused to accept that circumstances justified mediocrity. The journey home to Italy in 1946 carried terrible irony that Bellini recognized immediately. He was returning to devastated homeland where food remained scarce while departing country that had fed him better as prisoner than his own nation had provided as soldier. The fresh bread, roasted chicken, and thoughtfully prepared meals would remain impossible dreams in post-war Italy for years while Americans continued consuming such provisions routinely. But he carried knowledge more valuable than full stomach. He had witnessed military culture that achieved excellence through standards maintained voluntarily rather than enforced externally. He understood that prosperity emerged from systems that valued quality and invested in capability rather than merely accepting adequacy. The Marines had demonstrated that democracy could produce warriors who exceeded authoritarian ideals while simultaneously maintaining humanitarian values that fascism had declared weakness. The rations had been merely visible manifestation of deeper truths about societies and values. American strength derived not from special racial qualities or totalitarian efficiency but from economic systems that produced abundance and military culture that channeled that abundance toward effectiveness. Every meal he had consumed challenged fascist ideology more effectively than any propaganda could have achieved, revealing through simple daily experience that freedom produced prosperity while tyranny generated scarcity. Years later, Bellini would tell his children about the Marines who had taught him more through their field rations than any formal education could have provided. He would describe the fresh bread, the roasted chicken, and the casual excellence that pervaded everything they did. Most importantly, he would explain that true strength came not from deprivation that built character but from abundance that enabled achievement. The lesson was unforgettable, delivered through meals that exceeded imagination and revealed that paradise was possible for societies that chose freedom over control. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.